Good evening. I think the last time I was here, I was taking Japanese classes. Really good educational series here. I'm very honored to be at the Japanese Society and asked to introduce Dave Broom. I've known Dave for a couple of years now. We've definitely had some antics across the country. He's got a little microphone on. I just said he looks like a hairy Britney Spears. So I think, I got the book a couple weeks ago. It is actually a beautiful book, not only stylish, but incredibly written. So The Way of Whisky. Dave Broom has been writing about whiskey for about 25 years as a journalist and an author. He is very active and involved in whiskey education, acting as a consultant for major distilleries, including Suntory, and tasting techniques, as well as teaching professionals and public. Tonight, also, it's going to be moderated by Mr. Noah Rothbaum. He is the Daily Beast chief of cocktail and correspondent and editor of its drink and food section. Mr. Rothbaum is also the founding chief and editor for Liquor.com, which was awarded the James Beard Award in 2013. So I'm very pleased to have both of them on stage, and please welcome Dave Broom on stage and give him a round of applause. And again, the book will be signed out back.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a great honor to be here, actually. It's such an amazing room. I'm used to doing tastings and talks in kind of shady bars with lots of booze. And unfortunately, your licensing laws don't permit alcohol to be hard alcohol to be served in these events. But we can all have a drink afterwards, maybe. Yeah. Gardener's paying, so that's all right. Yeah, it might seem slightly strange having a Scotsman standing in New York talking about Japanese whiskey, but that's kind of the way of the world these days. Whiskey's always been a kind of global spirit. And Japanese whiskey has become an amazing global trend, and there's a real fascination and interest about Japanese whiskey these days. My own kind of story starts right back in, I suppose, the late 1990s, when Japanese single malts began to appear into the UK market. First of all, Yamazaki and then Haiku. And that was my first encounter with Japanese whiskey. I knew it had existed before, but it simply wasn't available in the export markets because the Japanese market consumed all of it. We'll touch on that a little bit later, perhaps. But in the year 2000, I was invited out to Japan for the first time, and I was hugely excited about this because I was always fascinated with Japan anyway, through poetry, through art, through Zen, through a whole number of different aspects of Japanese culture. So to be able to actually finally get there was always a great dream of mine. And I went with my old friend and mentor, Michael Jackson, the writer rather than the singer. And Michael and I arrived in my first day in Japan. It was a hugely, hugely exciting day. Had proper sushi for the first time, on a bullet train for the first time, arrived at Yamazaki, first Japanese distillery, and by the afternoon of my first day in Japan, I'm sitting in a room with the blending team from Suntory with glasses of whiskey in front of me, and I'm thinking, wow, this is the life, and also, oh my God, so wet behind the ears. And one of the things we were doing at that first tasting was that the day after, we were doing a comparison between Scotch and Japanese whiskey. Not what was better, but just what the differences were. So we were going through all of this. And I said to the blending team, what do you think the difference is between Japanese whiskey and Scotch? And a man called Masminabe, who worked for Suntory, said, we say it is transparent. There is a transparency about Japanese whiskey. I thought about that for a bit, and then I understood that suddenly it made sense, because if you have a glass of Japanese whiskey and a glass of Scotch in front of you, the complexities are probably of the same level between the two, but Scotch is more compressed. Scotch is more blurred, its complexity. It's quite hard to kind of get into exactly what is happening. It's all happening, but it's hard to get into. Whereas in Japanese whiskey, everything is stretched out. Everything's very clear. There's an aromatic intensity to it. There's a restraint, but an intensity. That's kind of weird paradox. We get lots of paradoxes as we move through the talk. But that aromatic intensity, that transparency, that ability to see the whiskey and to appreciate the flavors as they move in a very ordered way across the palate was something that immediately began to set Japanese whiskey apart for me. And I began to ask, as a whiskey geek, why is this transparency here? How do you make these whiskies transparent? And there's lots of very interesting geeky answers to that, which I won't go into, for we don't really have time. And I don't know if you're a whiskey geek audience, but if there are whiskey geeks out there, we can geek out later, okay? Because there are really sound technical reasons why the transparency exists. But there's more to it. And some of it comes from the history of Japanese whiskey. I'm not going to go into massive detail. Again, time's not permitting that. But again, Yamazaki is a fundamental part of this. So as well as there's a technical aspect, there was also a philosophical aspect as to why this transparency, why this character was created. And it came from the gentleman who's on your left, Shinjiro Tori, who's the founder of Suntory. And the man on the right is Masataka Taketsuru, who was a distiller at Yamazaki, who then went out to found his own company, Nika, in the 1930s. And what Tori wanted to do was create Japan's first whiskey. And in 1924, the spirit began to run from the stills at Yamazaki. In 1928, the first whiskey appears, and it's called Shirofuda, white label. And it was a huge success? No, it was a failure. It was a total failure because it was too heavy. It was too powerful. It was too smoky. It was too Scotchy. I think, the lights are going down. I thought I was dying for a second there. Sorry. It was a really weird sensation. I go into the light. Yeah, sorry. That was really weird. Sorry about that. So Shirofuda, disaster. Now, some brand owners might have said, well, okay, we'll just persevere because people are not used to the flavor. But what Tori said was, all right, let's have a look at this. And he made this very fundamental, very, very important decision. And he said, if I've got to make whiskey in Japan, I have to make a whiskey that appeals to the Japanese palate. And the Japanese palate is dictated to by Japanese food, and Japanese food is more delicate, so the whiskey has to be delicate. And the climate is more humid. And because the climate's more humid, the whiskey has to be refreshing. And it's going to be drunk with food, and it needs to be diluted. And everything about the sensibilities of the market and of the Japanese palate suddenly impinged themselves upon the style of the whiskey itself. And that's a really fundamental shift in thinking from just making a whiskey into making something which fits in with the way in which people are drinking, what the occasion is, and how they're drinking it, and what they're drinking it with. It's a big shift. And that's really where also that other second aspect of transparency comes through. And Taketsuru left the nascent Suntory in those days, 1930s, went up to Hokkaido, really to give himself some space, I think. And the style he made was always, and continues to be, slightly bigger, slightly heavier, slightly richer, but still with this transparency. So I think I would say the principles established by Tori continue to be demonstrated across all the distillers and all the distilleries in Japan itself. And I kind of kept going back. So I've been to Japan about 30 times. And I have been to Japan 30 times. Not even about 30 times. I have been 30 times. And every time I asked the question, what makes Japanese whiskey Japanese? And kind of new doors seem to be open. Because not because the doors were shut to me, but because the questions were stupid. And as soon as a sensible question was asked, the correct answer came through. And I just wanted to understand what lay beneath it. It wasn't just the technical stuff. It wasn't just Tori's decision. Because I like going down rabbit holes. I like asking why. And that's what a journalist does. We ask why. So why transparency? What lies beneath the transparency? Why is that there in the first place? And I began learning hugely from master blenders. That's Jota Tanaka here on your left, Shinji Fukuyo from Suntory, that's Jota's from Kirin, Shinji, who's up at the top, and then Sakuma-san from Nika at the bottom. These are my mentors. These are the guys who are telling me all about these whiskies. And what I began to wonder was, as I was examining this idea of what lies beneath, is, are there links between whiskey and traditional Japanese craft? Because whiskey is a cultural product, and this is what I believe increasingly. Whiskey is a cultural product. It's not just sitting there on its own. It's not made in a factory and just kind of put out there as a brand and kind of sitting over there. It's part and parcel of, it's made by creators. It's made by artists. There's a craft involved in making whiskey. So what I was asking myself is, are there links between the craft and the art of making whiskey and the art of Japanese ceramics or paper making or pewter or whatever? And I began to discern that there could be. But equally, it could be that I was just mad, and I was trying to impose some ideas, force ideas upon it. So I spoke to my publisher, and she's a wonderful lady. Thank you, Denise. I said, I'd like to write a book about Japanese whiskey, but I don't want to write a book which is a conventional whiskey book, because one of my friends was writing a fantastic book about Japanese whiskey, which I knew was going to be the big conventional whiskey book about the history and about lots of tasting notes and geeky facts. I wanted to write a book about what lies beneath and whether this link existed between art and craft and whiskey making. And amazingly, she said yes. So I went off and spent 3 weeks going around Japan with my now dear friend, Koei Take, who took all the photos for the book. So all the photos you're seeing tonight are made by Take. And we went around and we began asking these questions. What lies beneath? Why is Japanese whiskey Japanese? That's kind of what the book's about, guys. And went to various distilleries. That's Yamazaki, big heavy mash tun there. I'm not going to talk about whiskey production. But that's Yamazaki, one of the places that we kicked off at, just to try and get into the meat of the argument, or the possible argument. And then I had a moment of revelation. The moment of revelation came with this cup. This cup is on a table in kind of the back room of somebody's house, really. We were driving to Chichibu, to lovely distillery in Chichibu, and stopped off for lunch. We ate a lot on this trip. We stopped off for lunch in somebody's house. I thought we'd get lost. I thought we were asking for directions. It turned out we were actually eating in the back room of this person's house. And it's a little soba house. There's lots of buckwheat grown around there. So the soba, the buckwheat noodles, came from the fields around. There was a wonderful rich duck broth that we had with it, and that was probably from one of the ducks which were flying around, looking slightly worried. And amazing tempura. So just a fantastic place. And as part of the set menu, there was the option of having a whiskey. And it would be rude not to. I'm a whiskey writer, come on. And it was a dram of Ichiro Akuto, who we'll touch on in a second, his whiskey of the local distillery in the cup, which was made by the father of the guy who runs the restaurant from the clay, which is local. Boom, everything kind of sits in place. And I picked up the cup and I had a dram of the whiskey. And you can see it's just a beautiful cup. It's very simple, it's quite rustic, it's quite roughly textured, it's slightly irregular, it's nicely glazed, a very, very simple glaze going on, but there's a couple of flaws in it as well. But it just spoke to me because it had this quality of shibui. And shibui is it's one of these kind of slippery aesthetic terms that you get in Japan. That's kind of close to wabi-sabi, but not quite wabi-sabi. And shibui is really talking about objects which are quiet, but quite deep. They are restrained. They're not showy. They're not glitzy. There's a beautiful simplicity to them. There's a lack of decoration. And that is what, for me, kind of underpins so much of Japanese craft and Japanese art. There's an amazing exhibition upstairs. If you have time, please go to the exhibition. And you look at Japanese art, look at the way in which space is really important. What is not on the paper is as important as what is on the paper. Everything is drawing you into the piece of art or the cup or whatever, without being showing. And it's less about process, it's about linking with craftsmanship, with climate. It's a product of kind of mindset as much as anything. And all of the qualities of Shibui, which I thought demonstrated and amplified in that cup itself, are there in whiskey as well. Japanese whiskey, part of that transparency is it is understated. It's not shouting. Bourbon, I'm not knocking bourbon. I love bourbon. I love drinking bourbon. Bourbon and rye are kind of loud, you know? They kind of come in and go, hello, you know? Do you want a drink? You know? Scotch is kind of, hello. You do want a drink, you know? And Japanese whiskey is, I'm here. Please come. Give yourself to me. Restrained, understated, shibui. It is part and parcel of the whole thing. And that then we went up the road to see Ichiro, and that's Ichiro in his warehouse at Chichibu. And what Ichiro has done at this small distillery is really quite remarkable. I don't know how old he is, but the average age of, let's say he's in his early 50s. The average age of the workforce there is about 22, 23. It's a whole bunch of kids who want to learn how to make whiskey, and he doesn't turn anybody away. So it's this real buzz about the place. And he's persuaded local farmers who are growing soba in the time where their fields are not used, to plant local barley. He's going to start using his local barley. He's using local peat for smoking some of that barley. And the team learned how to plant barley and harvest barley, and they learned how to malt barley, and they learned how to smoke it. Every part of the process, even down to coopering, they have learned because they love learning. And they're learning from masters. And that's an important element as well, that there's this kind of thread of continuity going on from master to apprentice, and as that apprentice becomes a master, so passing it down the line. And then spreading whiskey out from just being the guys who are taking all this stuff in, for most of the barley is actually imported into Japan, and actually saying, this is part of us, rooting the whiskey back in an environment and in a locale, and making it Japanese by dint of that. Not just it's distilled in there, but it's actually grown there, and it's made by people who have fallen in love with it, and are now part very much of this web, this interlinked web of expertise, whether that's coming from farming or coopering or coppersmithing or whatever. And it's a way of kind of returning Japanese whiskey to its roots to a certain extent. So there's another thing which, and it's beginning to happen in Scotland as well, but all these areas are ways in which Japanese whiskey is defining itself, and defining itself almost against what is happening in Scotland. And the flavours are coming as a result of this, not kind of being imposed. They're coming as a result of that. They naturally flow from this process, if you want. And the next kind of area that I began thinking about, because as I said, we ate a lot on the trip, and you know, I've been going to Japan a lot, and the importance of texture within Japanese cuisine became an important element for me as well. And it's something I always look for when I'm tasting whiskey. You know, if we were tasting whiskey now, imagine we have a glass of whiskey. You probably want one at this particular moment. If you're tasting it, the first thing I always tell people to do is think about what it feels like, not what it tastes like, because you kind of know what it's going to taste like, not come automatically. What does it feel like? How does it move on your tongue? And that element of texture becomes really, really important in Japan. And it becomes very important in Japanese food. You know, whether the food is, you will have items of food on a plate or in a bento box or whatever, which are only there for textural purposes. You know, they're not there to give flavor. They're there because they're slippery, or they're there because they're crunchy, or they're hard, or they're soft. So texture is vitally important. And I'm not saying texture isn't important to a blender in Scotland or a whiskey maker in Scotland. But in Scotland, the texture kind of sits about this level, and it helps to drive flavor. It's an element within the overall flavor. In Japan, they're of equal status. So if you talk to a Japanese blender, you begin to actually talk about the feel and the mouthfeel and the texture as being an integral part and a really important part of driving that flavor coming through. And I was speaking about this with Jota Tanaka of Kirin, and he, by the way, we're just kind of looking at this kind of bizarre slide. That is a section of a grain column making grain whiskey at the Chichibu Distillery, which is owned by Suntory. I just think it's an amazing photo. It looks like a kind of alien spaceship that's just kind of landed. And I love that kind of that contrast between the kind of heavy industry and this natural background. Anyway, it's just a good shot. But grain whiskey, actually, that's the reason it's there. Thank you, Dave. That's why it's there. Is because grain whiskey for Jota and for, I would say, all the blenders, is the thing which gives umami. And umami is such an important, such an integral part of Japanese cuisine, and everybody begins to understand it now. I remember when I began talking about umami like 15, 16 years ago in Scotland, and if you say umami in Scotland, it sounds like you're calling for your mother, It's kind of, what is this? It doesn't exist. Now everybody kind of is happy with this idea of umami. Whiskey doesn't have umami, technically speaking, but it does have fatty acids, which add mouthfeel. And grain whiskey, which is used in blended whiskies, has richer elements of that. And Jota at Kirin makes 3 different styles, a heavy one, a medium-bodied one, and a light one. And he calls them the 3 umami brothers, because used in different percentages, they will add that mouthfeel, they will add that texture. And that is such an important driver in there. So it's not just about how a whiskey tastes, it's about how the whiskey feels as much as anything. And grain whiskey then becomes an important element, and also blends become important because Japanese whiskey was built on blends, just as Scotch was built on blends as well. So all of you who are whiskey lovers and think, well, single malt is the absolute pinnacle, don't forget blends, guys. Blends are very, very important. And I was also kind of talking about Jota about the way in which flavors change within whiskey. And there's this kind of belief all around the world that the older whiskey is, the better it is. Well, age is not a determinant of quality. The older whiskey is quite possibly the woodier it is, and actually it begins to drop in quality. And rather than thinking, this is coming from Jota, rather than thinking in terms of this kind of continuing, line of improvement starting from down there all the way up, thinking in terms of an arc of maturity. So that it's very vibrant and not a lot of wood at the beginning. And then round about the peak of maturity, everything's in perfect balance. So you've got the wood, you've got the spirit, you've got everything working together. And then towards the tail end, so the wood is beginning to come through and things are getting a little bit more bitter, a bit more dry, a bit more grip. It's not gone off, it's just changed. This arc of maturity. And if you're a very active cask, boom, that arc is going to be quite short. If you've got a very tired cask, it's going to be quite long. If you've got a light whiskey, it's going to be quicker. A heavy whiskey, it's going to be slower. And a blender is thinking 3 dimensions, putting all these different arcs together to create something which is complex. And that happens with whiskey all around the world. But again, in Japan, there's something that lies behind it. There's always something which lies behind it. And that's the concept of seasons within Japan. And seasons are divided into 3. In kind of classical Japanese approach to it. And the first part is called hashiri, and hashiri is the freshest part of whether it's a food, whether it's a vegetable, a fish, fruit, whatever. That's the first element. Shun is the peak, that peak maturation, or peak flavor rather. And nagori is that season coming to the end. And you think, well, that's great. And that shows kind of real awareness, a real deep awareness of how things change. And you think, well, that's fine, because we've got 4 seasons in a year, have we not? Well, I think we've got 5 in Scotland, including that week that we call summer. But in the old lunar calendar in Japan, there are 72 seasons of 5 days each. And each of them has its own hashiri, shun, and nagori. And this is incredibly focused about when something is absolutely at its peak. This very deep, deep focus, and that's what drives kaiseki, that's what drives cuisine, that's part of food culture, and also then it is in the mind of the whiskey blender as well, how things move. That anticipation of freshness and vibrancy when a whiskey is young, that peak moment, and then that bitterness at the end, pulled together It's about impermanence as well. Nothing lasts forever. Everything is kind of moving and finishing and moving on. Something new is going to be taking its place. And I got kind of obsessed with this idea. And I said, well, actually, this also applies to the palate. This applies to the way that you taste whiskey and you drink whiskey. When you pick up a glass of whiskey and you take a little sip of it, wow, there's that immediacy, there's that anticipation. It's fresh, it's exciting. And in the middle of your tongue, it should be softening down. Everything's cohering in the middle of the tongue. That's it at its peak. And then at the end, that's where the smoke, that's where the wood, that's where the bitterness is going to come through. And pushing it right into the realms of pretentiousness, I would say there is an element of melancholy as that glass is finished. But there's always another glass to have. So the next season starts off again. So this is then also part and parcel of how you begin, how Japanese distiller and Japanese blender begins to think of it. And I talked to Jota about it, and then I began talking to Shinji Fukuyo at Suntory about this idea. And he went, well, yes, yeah, that's exactly the way that we think of it. We think of flavor as having seasons. This is part and parcel of where we are. Again, Japanese culture and this aesthetic way is part and parcel of the creative process of whiskey making in that country. So it was time then to go and test out so whether I was mad or not, and whether actually there were these links, active links taking place between traditional craftsmanship and whiskey. And one of the stops we made was to Uji. Uji is just outside Kyoto, very, very famous for its tea. It was one of the earliest places that tea was grown in Japan at the tail end of the 12th century. And Taki and I spent an afternoon rolling tea, learning how to do it the traditional way, spreading it out, rolling it, pressing it, squeezing it, rubbing it between our fingers, making these wonderful little needles. We did not too bad at all. And at the end of it, we had a cup of tea. That's our tea being poured there by our master. And he said, yeah, that's pretty good. And I said, where does the tea usually go? Who do you sell it to? Obviously, it wasn't going to be a supermarket. And he went, the Emperor. And I went, oh, right, okay. I don't think ours was quite that good, but we had a good crack at it. And that, I was asking him about what it was like, about working and where he was. And he was learning from his grandfather, who's the master of traditional tea making. And he's saying, well, I just lose myself in the process. I go very zen about the whole thing. It's just part of the process. It's becoming one with the tea leaves, understanding rhythm and squeezing and moisture, and just learning by repetition and repetition and repetition. And opposite was a pottery. And we went into the pottery, and it's a Saiyaki pottery, and this is Matsubayashi-san. And he handed me his card, and it said, Matsubayashi-san, 15th generation. Okay. So you probably know what you're doing, Well, I didn't say, I thought that. That would have been rude. 15th generation on that site. They've been making pots and tea bowls on that site using Uji clay for all these generations, because the tea was there and people needed to have tea bowls. It made sense to have there. And Uji clay is amazing. And Uji clay has got its own very specific qualities, which we could go into detail, but I don't have time to. And they, the family themselves, were then very influential in terms of, there was a guy called Bernard Leach who brought kind of traditional Japanese craft and Japanese pottery over to Britain, started up pottery schools in Britain. And, I mentioned his name because, I was fascinated by that. And they went, oh, yeah, my great-uncle built his kiln for him. And I was going, oh, my God, the connections are here. And we were talking about creativity, and we were talking about the creative process. And about how he approaches, creating something new, the importance of the clay itself, the materials, how that was really important. We were taking a little walk through, and we ended up in front of this thing that looks a bit like a samurai warrior there on the right-hand side, and that's the kiln. And he said, I spend all the time with the clay and making something, and then I put it in the kiln, and we seal the kiln, and then I pray. Because we can't control it anymore. We can't control the firing. And if I was able to, it would not be interesting. It's good that happens. Because, and I'll quote here, there's always something beyond which we have never seen. I can control up to one point, but then all the other elements come into play. And then he went on to say that he had this conversation with Koshimizu-san from the blender from Suntory. And Koshi said, well, yeah, that's exactly the same in whiskey. We spend all that time making spirit, and then we put it in a cask, and we roll the cask away, and we go, we kind of know. We know what the parameters are. We know what it should be, but we really don't know exactly what it should be. And it's that respecting of nature, that respecting of chance, that ability to say we can control and then leave it up to chance. That's actually an integral part of Japanese craft as well. And we tend to think, I think in the West, or certainly I used to think, it's all about control. It's all about everything being engineered, everything being planned to the nth degree. But no, chance is a very important element within the creative process. Because here's kind of Leonard Cohen comes in at this point. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. The flaws are important. The randomness is important. And within the creative process, if you are just following a track down the line, just making the same thing day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out, it will end up being boring if you know every single aspect of that. You will make vodka. I can say that, can't I? And what's much more interesting is that having the knowledge of what you have to do when you're on that path, but then taking a step off that path and heading into the wild, heading off into the wilderness, because that's where the creative world is. And that is what is happening in ceramic studios, and that's what's happening in whiskey distilleries as well, this acceptance of the randomness of life. And then we then went to see this extraordinary woman who I could just do a lecture on alone, called Eriko Haruki. And Eriko Haruki is traditional, she's not traditional, but she has moved washi, which is traditional Japanese paper making, into a completely new art form. And her architectural washi, some of the bigger pieces will be, some of the pieces will be the size of that photo on the screen there. Massive pieces, incredibly complex. Some of them are dyed, but different sheets of paper, like 6 different sheets of paper. So you've got one image when the light's shone from one side, different image when it's coming from the other side. It's like magic. Some have got holes punched through them. Really radical stuff, and inspiring stuff. Totally inspiring women, self-taught. And I was talking to her about, again, about the creative process, but also about innovation, because washi making is ultra traditional. The purity of the paper and the integrity of the paper is what was important. And here is this newcomer coming in saying, actually, what I want you to do is punch holes in it, or dye it. And everybody would throw a bucket of different colored dye onto this sheet of paper as it's beginning to be made. And everybody will do it, will know roughly where it's going to be, but we have to accept chance. And I was talking to her about innovation and how she's doing it, and whether she was just a radical. And she went, well, no, because, the tradition of today is the innovation of yesterday. That's what life is about. Everything has to move forward. If you just stick and think, well, we know how to make it, you will die. And today's tradition, has to move forward. Everything has to move forward. The innovations that she's making today will eventually become traditions in their own right. And that is a fundamental part and parcel of Japanese whiskey making as well. And it's part to do with this Kaizen mentality of slow and steady incremental improvement. If you were to ask a Scotch distiller what the most important thing in terms of whiskey making was, they would say consistency. You're making Talisker the same today, tomorrow, the day after, and all the way into the future. And that's really hard to do. It's actually very, very hard to do. It's a highly skilled job to be able to do that, so I'm not knocking that at all. But that's the way the Scotch industry works. If you ask the Japanese distiller the same question, they will say, we want to make whiskey better tomorrow. It's a fundamental difference. It's a big philosophical difference between that approach to what whiskey is. So if you picked up a glass of Yamazaki 12-year-old made of a latest batch and compared it to a Yamazaki 12-year-old for, say, 15, 20 years ago, you would say, fine, okay, I can understand there's commonalities between them. It's identifiably Yamazaki 12, but it's different now. And you say that to Shinji, and he'll go, yeah, thank you. If you said that to Scotch distiller, they would go away and shoot themselves. And that's really important. That's vitally important because that sense of innovation and that sense of moving things forward is part and parcel of what it means to be a distiller in Japan. And actually being radical enough to make some really big changes, like Suntory. No, I'm going geeky for a second. Sort of taking out steam heating, a very gentle way of heating your stills, which most people use all around the world, and putting direct fire back into the stills because they anticipated that people in 10 years' time were going to be wanting to drink whiskies which had more body to them. Forward thinking, forward planning, changing tradition, allowing tradition to move forward in order to preserve it. But also thinking about preserving things. I think that the most important, one of the reasons, that Japanese whiskey began to become popular was because it became available around the world. And the reason it was becoming available around the world in the late 90s and into the beginning of this century was because the Japanese market had gone into fairly serious decline for ultimately it was about 25 years of decline. So there was a lot of stock kicking around. But then there was this fairly radical shift in thinking and in creating whiskies, and a realization that you have to move forward, you have to do it. So all these kind of big decisions about how whiskey was made and how whiskey was produced changed fundamentally at the tail end of that particular process. So it's a living tradition, in other words. That's what I'm saying. So let's move on to kind of maybe the last distillery before Noah quizzes me with lots of Q's. Apparently I've got to give him lots of A's. So there we go. So our last distillery is Haiku. So this kind of build on what I was talking about earlier, just a second ago. Because if those of you who've been around a Scotch distillery will recognize that, will have seen the stills will all be kind of the same shape and size. The wash stills will be the same shape, the spirit stills will be the same shape. You walk into Haiku and you kind of go, what the hell is going on here? Because all the stills are different shapes and sizes. Some are big, some are small, some have got arms going up, some arms going down. And the shape and the configuration of the still will help to produce different flavors. That's the important thing that's going on there. And there's a great example of Japanese innovation at work. This was the biggest single malt distillery in the world in the 1980s. And it was producing a very light style because that was what the Japanese palate wanted. And then the market crashed. The big still house, the original still house was mothballed, and this radical new way of thinking about what whiskey would be in the future was brought into play with lots of stills in different shapes and different sizes. Producing a whiskey which is identifiably still Haiku, but in a slightly different manifestation to what it was in the past. And Haiku, for me, is just one of the most remarkable distilleries. I love all whiskey distilleries, but it's something special about that place. It's a big site. It's in the forest in the South Japan Alps, and it seems to distill the place itself. It's in the middle of these kind of great kind of pine forests, and it smells of fresh pine. And it smells of mint, and it smells of wet grass, and it smells of herbs, and green fruits, and freshness, and a little bit of smoke coming from a cabin somewhere halfway up the mountain, just kind of filtering its way through the forest. That's what Haiku is. A remarkable distillery, distilling its place and understanding nature, somehow manifesting itself in the glass. Again, slightly different way of thinking in terms of whiskey compared to what was happening in Scotland. So I did a tour of Haiku with another old friend, a man called Mike Miyamoto, who some of you might have met. He was manager of Yamazaki, then Haiku. And then Mike went on to become the first global brand ambassador for Suntory. And he spent a lot of time over here in the States. Amazing man, lovely man. He spent a lot of time in Glasgow, actually, which, obviously a sign of a quality individual. And his daughter was born there. And his daughter still has a really broad Glasgow accent. It's brilliant. The only Japanese person I've met with a broad Glasgow accent. And after the visit, we went off for a meal. And over a few drinks, it has to be said, there was quite a few drinks, I said, well, Mike, I've got to ask you the question I've been asking everybody. What makes Japanese whiskey Japanese? And he went, Because it's made in Japan, Dave. I went, great. This book's now going to be a pamphlet, you know? But he said, no. He said, I wasn't being glib. You know, I was saying, it's because the flavors are around us. And everything we do in a Japanese fashion. And thinking back, you know, it's not Tori suddenly going, you know, I want to do this. It's kind of intuitive. It's not like forcing something into whiskey. It's not saying, oh, we have to then put in shibui, we have to put in wabi-sabi, we have to put in this idea of umami and texture, we have to put in, you know, all this idea of seasonality. It's there. It's part of the DNA of being Japanese if you're working in this kind of aesthetic field. And he's saying everything we do is whiskey, is do, something. It's the way of. Karate, do, judo, flower arranging, pottery, food, and whiskey. He went, whiskey do. That's what we do. At Suntory, he said, we don't talk about production. Whiskey making is not production, which is kind of Scottish way of describing whiskey. We pursue quality and character. And whiskey making and whiskey do is the art of craft and nature. And that's a pretty big and radical way of thinking about it. And then I was thinking on this, you know, as kind of came to the tail end of the trip, about, but where is all this coming from? What's the root of all of this? You know, all this, you know, all the guys we went to see, an amazing guy doing pewter work, one of the last two guys doing traditional pewter work in Kyoto, went to glassmakers, incense guys, which is another area of conversation we might want to talk about, Noah. So talking to all these people, and there's this consensus of opinion. Yes, whiskey is part of this world. Very much part of it. I was thinking, well, but where is that coming from? What's the starting point? What's the genesis of this Japanese aesthetic? And it comes down to a man called Senrikyu. And Senrikyu, who lived in the 16th century, was the Zen priest who formalized what we now know as the tea ceremony. And up until that point, the tea ceremony had been a Chinese tea ceremony. It was very it was a bling thing. You know, it was about, you know, my cup is bigger than yours, or my cup is more gold than yours, and mine is better, my tea is better, my decoration is better. It's all showing off. Conspicuous consumption, you know. I'm not going to talk about your president at this point, you know. So I'm in New York, I feel safe. But what Rikyu did was actually strip everything back to the basics. To say, actually, the tea ceremony is about tea. It's about the flavors of the tea. It's about making the tea. It's about making everything humble. It's about making everything stripped back. It's about modesty. It's about a simple hut. It's about rustic cups. It's about allowing the tea to speak and stripping away all that ornamentation and decoration. Where have we heard that before? It's that kind of transparency thing. And out of the tea ceremony came a need for different sort of teacup, which gave birth to ceramics, and different lacquerware, which gave birth to Japanese lacquerware, and then to architecture. And all the way it spins on, spins on, and spins on, and spins on. Rikyu at the heart of it all. And I was thinking about that and headed back to Yamazaki. And I was getting off the train with Shinji. And Yamazaki, you come out the station, you kind of walk up, you turn right, go up a wee hill, turn left, down the hill. And he pointed at this old house that they'd walked past a few times. And he said, has anybody told you about that house? I went, no, it's just a lovely old Japanese house. He went, that's Rikyu's house. That's where the first tea house was. I was kind of, what? And so I was thinking about this on the way down, about Tori. And one of the things you hear about Shinjiro Tori was, you know, he's a very clever man, and the reason he based his distillery at Yamazaki was because there was good quality water, which you need. There's a confluence of 3 rivers, which gave humidity, which is good for maturation. And it was also close to markets, so it was a commercial reason for doing it. And that's good, tick, tick, tick. And then, well, hang on a minute. This is the man, the father of Japanese whiskey, who is allying it with Japanese palate and Japanese sensibilities and making it Japanese, is building a distillery on the spot, pretty much, where the founder of Japanese aesthetics had his first tea house. I don't think that's a coincidence, guys. I think that everything begins to kind of mold together at that particular point. And then I went and had a highball. This is a bar called Sambora at Sambora's in Osaka, that particular one's in Osaka. This guy, amazing, great highballs, frozen whiskey. You don't need ice. Put your kakibin or any whiskey in the freezer, put the glasses in the freezer, have very cold soda water. You can make it in 10 seconds. And you probably drink it in 20, you know. But it's quite strong, be aware. But, you know, sitting there, you know, thinking about at the end of a trip with Take, and just thinking about what we'd learned and all of that, all of this, which I've tried to compress into 40 minutes. How did it all come together? I was thinking, well, you know, every day all these craftsmen are getting up, you know, whether you're working in pewter or glass or pottery or being a whiskey maker or whatever, everybody's getting up and they're repeating what they did the day before, but they're trying to move it forward. They're understanding nature. They're not imposing themselves in an egotistical way on the thing they are making. They're making the thing itself shine, making the thing itself be the important thing. Very Japanese. Everything linked together in this kind of matrix of aesthetic. And then I thought, well, it's interesting because all of Japan's crafts were kind of washed up on its shores. You know, a lot came from Korea, a lot came from China, some came in from the south as well. Whiskey came from Scotland. But over the years, over the centuries, it was turned into something which had an identifiably Japanese stamp to it. It was molded by time, it was molded by climate, it was molded by season, by philosophy, by Zen, which we haven't really touched on at all, and war, by poverty. You know, food comes out of the poverty as well. It came out of kind of richness of heart, it came out of perseverance, it came out of isolation, and it also came out of openness as well. And all of those principles, my friends, are why Japan makes the best Japanese whiskey in the world. Thank you very much. I'm also very scared about getting anything on such an incredibly beautiful table, actually, so I probably won't drink any water at all. I'm now extremely nervous. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful.
Thanks. Thank you.
I got your book, I don't know, a couple months ago, an advanced copy, and hearing you talk about, you know, traditional Japanese ceramicist, it made me think a lot about publishing, right? So, you know, writers, we have an idea, we put it together, it goes into the kiln, you know, you've no idea, right? You have no control. At that point, you've no control, right? It goes out into the world, you have no idea if anybody's going to read it, if anybody's going to buy it, if it's going to be, by the time it gets out, maybe whatever you've written about is over, right? You know, but I think that you've somehow, I mean, I know this is book, what, 11 for you?
Yeah, some are quite small.
Okay.
You know, so.
He's being modest, and some of them are quite large. Yeah. But this one, it seems perfectly timed, right? That it came out almost at the height. I mean, you were talking about sort of a curve, you know, like you have the interest in America for Japanese whiskey, you know. I mean, years ago, you'd go to Whiskey Fest, and, you know, it was just Suntory, and they were just pouring Yamazaki, and there wasn't much of a line, right? I'd always go. They had lovely, amazing pen, pencil contraption made out of a barrel, which I still have many of them. And there, you know, you could walk right up and taste whatever you want. Now, you know, it's at what I call Pappy Van Winkle levels, right? Where you can't even get near the table. Yeah. And the same kind of level of interest, people come up to me who, you know, used to want to talk about Pappy, now want to ask about Japanese whiskey. Yeah. And seemingly your book came out at the height of this. You know, what was this, you know, were you shocked that, you know, the Japanese whiskey has really taken off in America the way that it has?
I'm delighted it's taken off. In many ways, it's slightly worrying it's taken off because there's not actually a huge amount of stock at the moment because of that great 25-year decline. But that will change, guys, and prices moved off. Yeah, I'm very excited that it's happened. I think it's an inevitability of the way in which people are viewing whiskey these days. You know, I think the parochialism which kind of infected whiskey for a long time, you know, you only drank what your country made. I think Scotch might have been an exception to that. I think that's gone. I think people's minds are much more open to understanding the fact that that distillers all around the world have their different techniques, and principles and philosophies of making something like whiskey. So it's, Canadian whiskey is fundamentally different to bourbon, and bourbon is fundamentally different to Irish and Scotch, etc.
Yeah.
So it sounded like a joke that I'm saying Japan makes the best Japanese whiskey in the world, but it's Scotland makes the best Scotch. And Sweden makes the best Swedish. And I think that's what's important about whiskey these days, is that there's an identifiable character which you can trace back to that particular source. And I think people are just interested in the local. Yeah. I think that they're, this idea, this palpable integrity to whiskey. It comes from this spot on the earth. I think is appealing to people's sensibilities these days.
Well, you just wrote a story for me at the Daily Beast where we send you both to the most northern and the most southern whiskey distilleries in the world, right?
I'm hoping to do the most easterly and westerly, actually. I think that's going to be quite an interesting philosophical conundrum, that one. Yeah, they'll probably both be in London, but on both either side of the Greenwich Meridian.
Well, and I think there's a line in there where you said that basically everywhere around the world people are making single malt, right? I mean, whether it's New York State or Japan has obviously been doing it for a long time, but Sweden, I mean, everybody seems to be making single malt now.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, do you think that there's a reason why it's single malt and not something else?
I think it's a good question. I think it's because it comes back to that previous point that single malt is a great way to kind of manifest that particular thing. And there's an interesting thing about single malt that. I was taking a training course in Scotland last week, and we were at Talisker Distillery, and you can only make Talisker at Talisker. Yes. You can only make Lagavulin at Lagavulin because they tried. You can make Lafroig at Lafroig, etc., etc. So I think that is one reason that a lot of kind of two things maybe. A lot of the new distillers fell in love with Scotch single malt to begin with. And the stories are, I was with my friends on a skiing trip or a fishing trip or a birthday party. In other words, drink was consumed. And at some point over the weekend, they went, we could do this. A small percentage of them went away and went ahead and did it. So it kind of came from that. So it was kind of, yes, it's coming from Scotland, and then it's, but how do we make it ours? Right. And I think it's just a fascinating spirit, because it's a humble spirit. It's barley, water, yeast, and the influence of wood. But the infinite variations that you can play in that, I think, are simple. So you can do it in a fairly easy way. Well, it's complicated, but, yeah.
Well, and I think that's sort of, not that many of these countries follow, but kind of the lesson of Japanese whiskey, right? I mean, Shinjiro Tori, the first whiskey that they make is very Scotch-like, right? Sure. It's almost too Scotch-like, and then they realize, maybe we adapt it to, we add all these other aesthetics and techniques, and it becomes our own. And I think that the amazing thing about it is that it, whiskey almost becomes a vessel, right, for local traditions and even the way that people are drinking it, and the most successful single malts or global single malts are ones where the people aren't like, I want to make Jack Daniels, or I want to make this brand or that brand, I don't, where they're like, okay, like I have my favorites, and now I'm gonna make something that.
I think that's vitally important. I think that's why it's so exciting what's happening in Japan at the moment, because there's a lot of new distilleries opening up. Ironically, just after the book was finished, a lot of distilleries opened up. But volume 2, who knows? Right. So it's beginning to happen in Japan as well, and it's interesting to see what these guys are doing, because a lot of them are following from Ichiro. But Ichiro is actually following on from what Suntory is doing as well. So there's still this continuum. But the approaches by the smaller distillers, who are distilling at the same scale as something like Yamazaki or Haiku, is going to be very interesting, because there's going to be local peat and local barley. It's becoming more important. But I would say the fundamental principles of Japaneseness will still be there, but you'll get an even greater spread. So it's really exciting times.
I think it's also fascinating because you have distillers in other countries now looking to Japan as a model. Right?
And it's become the model. If you talk to certainly a lot of the guys in Scandinavia, everybody initially looked at Scotch, and now. Everybody's looking at Japan. You look at the guys at Westland, Matt Hoffman, it's an extraordinary distillery. Matt is taking as much from Japan, in fact more from Japan than he is probably from Scotland at the moment. And that's down to Kaizen, it's down to geeky stuff as well. It's down to kind of process, if you want to use that word, production. But it's also about that real intense attention to detail. Not that it doesn't happen in Scotland, but I don't think it happens with the same intensity as it does in Japan. And I think that's a lesson that distillers around the world are learning.
Yeah. You alluded to before, almost Japanese whiskey has almost gotten too popular, right?
Yeah.
Do you think, there are a lot of, I've seen a lot of clickbaity headlines about a coming Japanese whiskey shortage.
No, there is a Japanese whiskey shortage. It's not coming at all. Yeah, it's there. And you go to Japan, there's not a lot of whiskey. The thing is, whiskey takes time, and the industry was in serious decline for a very long time. As I said, I first went out there in 2000. I think it was 2005 before I actually saw any spirit run in a distillery.
Wow.
So they were either closed, like Kurizawa, or Hanyu or Mars, which thankfully has reopened. The other two haven't, or on really, really short-term working. And as a result of that, some stock was freed up, so the export market began to pick it up, and the Japanese distillers sort of said, well, okay, fine, we're not going to be an export market. We're going to, and that's great. And then Mizutani-san from Suntory said, okay, right, last chance, let's try and get the Japanese market drinking whiskey again. And I went to Sambora and went to Rockfish and went, hang on, they're selling a case of Kakubin a day, so people must be drinking whiskey, and they're drinking highballs, whiskey and soda, and did a big promotional campaign about whiskey and soda. Young people in izakaya all around Japan, and young people went, young people, see, I'm so old. Young people went, wow, this is a great drink. This is the kind of drink that their grandfathers have been drinking. Whiskey soda, fantastic. And now you can get it everywhere. You can get it in, half-pint mugs, and that thrills me as a Scotsman. Drinking a half-pint of whiskey is, the height of.
No wonder there's a shortage.
And then, so as a result of that, boom! Suddenly the domestic market picks up. A few years back, there was a soap opera on Japanese television, an early morning soap opera, 15-minute episodes about the love story between Taketsuru and Rita, who was his Scottish wife.
Which was,
boom!
Yeah.
It went ballistic, and suddenly, the second wave, which affected Nika as well, but it rippled across. And suddenly there simply wasn't the whiskey, because nobody could have predicted that was going to happen. So it's going to be another 5, 6, 7 years before everything begins to balance out. That's the nature of the beast.
We've seen with Scotch, obviously, there's also supply issues as the world has, thoroughly embraced.
It's anything with an aged spirit, I don't know what I'm going to be eating for my tea tomorrow night. I certainly don't know what I'm going to be drinking 10 years' time. So, it's pretty tough business trying to predict what the whiskey market's going to do. And occasionally people get it wildly wrong. But I don't think the Japanese distillers got it wildly wrong. Nobody could have anticipated this boom.
Well, with the Scotch boom, the recent one, we've seen it, the way that the companies have dealt with it, removing age statements from a lot of brands and, replacing them with no age statements. Beam Suntory, which obviously owns, Suntory owns now, removed Lefroy 18, in America. Some landmark bottling. Yeah. How do you think it will affect Japanese whiskey? Will we see younger whiskeys being bottled?
There's certainly, Nika, who are still really strapped for stock, took all the age statements off their whiskies, bar Taketsuru 17, which is small quantities anyway. Suntory took off some of the younger, so actually the 10-year-old expressions, retained the other ones for the older ones, but also brought in no age statement ones. But it was interesting talking to Sakuma-san and Shinji about their thinking behind no age, because they've approached it in a very sensible way. That, and it's something that Sakuma-san said to me. He said, if I was making Yoichi 15-year-old, what I wanted to do, because they make multiple different styles of Yoichi at the distillery, which is something, again, we didn't really touch on maybe. At 15-year-old, I wanted a snapshot of what Yoichi was like in all its manifestations at 15, different castes, different styles, etc. Boom, that was that. With no age, not having to declare an age on it, it allows me free reign to have something that's very old, something that's here, something that's there, something that's there. So it's a part of a creative process. But, and this was the important point, which was echoed by all the other Japanese blenders, it has to be better than the whiskey it's replacing, or at least of equal quality.
Which is hard. I mean,
Which is hard, but that's why they're blenders, that's why they're great at their jobs. And I wish that all the Scotch distillers who took age statements off had followed the same advice. Some did, but a lot didn't.
And hard too.
And they've got a kicking, and I think it deserved kicking as a result of that.
And hard too when you don't have the older whiskeys that often add that.
Yeah.
Would you, I mean, I think, you know, your book is both, you know, the writing is beautiful, the introduction is really lovely. I mean, the only sad part about it is that when you look up from the book, you are not in Japan. It is so transportive, and the photos are really beautiful.
Yeah, no, Taki, it was just it was a dream to travel with him. We hadn't met before, you know. We just met in the hotel the night before we were setting off on the trip. You know, he sent a portfolio.
Right.
He just sat down and he said, you know, what do you want? I said, well, you know, nothing posed. A lot of hands, eyes, craft, atmosphere. He talked him through the book. He went, yeah, okay, yeah, I get it. Let's go and drink some sake, and we did.
Right.
You know, and yeah, he's just a dear friend. So yeah, it's very much a collaborative effort. You know, and it was about halfway through the book. I was thinking, how do I pull all of this together? And I realised that actually the road trip was the story. That is the narrative. So there isn't a big chunk about history. You know, the history of Japanese whiskey is dropped in at appropriate points through the narrative, and it's kind of learning, and genuinely what I was learning as I was going through.
Do you think that if you went back, let's say in 10 years or 20 years, will it be very different, or do you think that the traditions will continue?
I think traditions will continue, but I think that Kaizen mentality will have shifted things on. So we'll look back to what it was and go, wow, yeah, when you were doing that, you were tasting that, and that's what's exciting for me. That it's not this idea of it being kind of stuck in amber. You know, it's not. It's not ossified, which is what worried me about Scotch, and I think things are changing in Scotch now. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in Scotch, but the Scotch has been late to realise that, and it's kind of playing catch-up as a result. But because it's an integral part of that Japanese psyche to move things forward, I think in 10 years' time it'll be, wow, you know, look where we are.
Well, we did a panel last summer, I think it was last summer, at Tales of the Cocktail in New Orleans about Alfred Bernard, who was the original whiskey writer. It was a time of phylloxera had destroyed all of the vineyards all over Europe. People in London and in England, you know, were like, okay, we're really thirsty. We can't get what we normally drink. We hear that they make something up in Scotland. Like, is this at all an option? And, you know, Bernard went up there and really, like, you know, his descriptions of the distilleries and the drawings, I mean, many ways, you know, from the sections that we read and discussed at that panel, I mean, it could be today. I mean, like and you know, and that's so much of what Scotch is this, you know, preservation of history and technique. And
there's nothing wrong with preservation of history and appreciation and understanding of heritage. I think that's vitally important, and I think that exists in Japan. You know, that reverence for that line which has been passed down from master to apprentice all the way through time. But like Eriko Haruki was saying, you know, if that stops, then it dies because people move. You know, there's this kind of thing at the moment in Scotch that there's this kind of golden age of Scotch, and we should return to a golden age. Well, we can't go back.
Right.
You know, life is about moving forward. You know, that's part of the natural process. You know, you have to continue to move forward, be cognizant, and perhaps adapt old techniques into the modern day because that's what the market is. That's what palates are beginning to do. But you can't just.
Or those changes are done very quietly and subtly. You know, like the direct fire stills. You know, or sort of take it. And so even as much as we'd like to say that bourbon or Scotch has been made the same way as they did. No.
I
mean, it's definitely.
No, of course it's changed. It's changed radically.
But at least it's. I think in Japan there's an embrace of that ethereal nature and things change.
I think a lot of the changes in Scotch were in order to maintain that consistency. So they were driven by how do we make it more efficient?
Right.
You know, this kind of dreadful word, efficient.
Right.
How can we make more alcohol per ton of barley? And in a consistent fashion, but make it more efficient. And as a result, I think character has been lost, and the innovations have not come by wanting to make quality and move things forward. The innovations have come to try and actually make more booze. And that's not the Japanese way of doing it.
Do you think with all of these different...
I'm not going to be allowed back to Scotland, actually.
You'll have to stay here.
Yeah. It's not being broadcast, is it?
With all these different regions and countries now making single malt, do you think, of all of them besides Scotland and Japan, which one do you think has the best chance of sort of breaking out and becoming, internationally known for their single malt?
I think Scandinavia. I think watch out for that. I think they've really got their heads around what they can make, and it's a wide variety of styles. But I think there's you're beginning to see that it's still young. You're beginning to see a kind of Nordic, a grouping of Nordic styles. I think that's going to be very exciting. I think the new stuff that's happening in Ireland. I think. This is Ireland coming up. I think, to be honest, whiskey-wise, I think Canada is going to be the next big thing, because they've got volume and amazing whiskey, and, being very Canadian, they've always been slightly apologetic about everything, and are now kind of believing that they make great whiskey. So, watch out for Canada. I think Australia, sadly, until distillers begin to make it in volume, will continue to kind of just bump along making great stuff, but not in any particular volume. But there's really amazing stuff happening all around the world. Really, it's seriously, I got an email from somebody last week saying, "Hello, my name is X. I live in Peru. I want to start making whiskey."
Great.
So yeah, it'd be great. Peruvian whiskey. Why not?
It's Dave's next article.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. You'll be signing books.
I will
out there. So
I
would
have a
urge
Sharpie
everybody to get one. It's really a beautiful book. And
thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Noah. Thanks, guys. Thank you.